Hello you, and welcome to the Silent Why podcast. I'm Claire, host and everything else to do with putting the podcast together. And I'm throwing in a bonus episode here with a bit of a difference. For those of you that listen regularly, you'll be used to hearing my blog episodes, where I read my online blog to make them into podcast episodes, and all the other types of episodes that I do outside of the main 101 Loss interviews that I do with Chris. You'll also know that I love to write, that I'm working on final edits of my first novel, that my husband and I are childless, that I struggle with health issues after being thrown into surgical menopause in my late 30s, and that I love marzipan. However, what you might not know is that I also do talks at church. I don't share a lot about my faith on the podcast because it's not what the podcast is about, but I enjoy speaking to people in lots of different capacities, whether that's one-on-one, through a podcast, or up the front of a group of people. And church allows me to talk and share about something else that I'm passionate about, as well as grief, loss and hope. So I thought I'd share one of my very recent talks with you. Why, you might ask? Well, I'm sharing this particular talk because it's about grief. It mentions the podcast, which you know about, but those sat listening didn't know about. And it talks about hope and my personal reasons for faith in Jesus. And I thought some of you might be interested in hearing me talk about grief in a different setting, and why ultimately I believe faith helps in the really dark times that we go through. The talk I'm going to share is from a service we had at our church this month in October called All Souls. It's a day in the church calendar to remember those that have died. It happens around All Hallows Eve, known as Halloween to most. Ahead of the service, anyone at all can send in a name of someone to remember, and during the service we read them out and light a candle for each person that's lost. It's a very moving time of reflection, and it's a service that attracts people whether they're part of the church or not, whether they have a faith or not. This year, our vicar and my good friend Mike asked me if I'd be willing to do the talk. It's just a 10 to 15 minute slot to talk about something relevant to those that have come to remember lost ones, but also to speak about the hope that is offered through our faith. A chance to talk to people about grief and add in one of the many things that's been a lifeline to me and mine. Of course I'm going to say yes to that. So I thought I'd share the talk that I did with you as well. You might have a faith, you might not, but chances are if you're listening to this podcast you know something about grief, and you've probably lost someone you love. In which case, just imagine you're one of the people who turned up to remember them. I'll set the scene for you. We meet in a church hall. The seats are arranged in 2 rows that run in a circle. In the middle of the circle is a table with 2 large candles on it, lit, and many tea lights, which will be lit during the reading of the names. The lighting in the room is dim. I was sitting at the back of one of the 2 rows. Sarah, my other good friend, and Mike's wife, stood to do the Bible reading, which was Psalm 34 if you want to look that up. And then when she finished, I stood to do my bit. Hello, I'm Claire, and I've been part of the St George's Church family here for about 4 years. And during the week, I host and edit a podcast about grief. Through the podcast, I've interviewed many people about their losses, whether that's going through the death of a loved one at any age, or grieving other losses like divorce, redundancy, retirement, losing health or mobility, losing your identity, or maybe being childless like my husband and me. Almost certainly, you'll know what the pain of loss feels like. There are many losses that need to be grieved, but today we are focusing on the loss of life. Pregnancies, babies, children, young adults, the elderly, family, friends, relatives or colleagues, people that are no longer with us. We're probably here today to remember people we loved, because grief and love are closely entwined parts of the human experience. One of my podcast guests said, "You only grieve if you love. That makes you more of a human being, not less." And so we will all experience grief because we all love something or someone, and eventually everybody dies. And I also want to acknowledge the added complications in grief when we lose someone we had a difficult relationship with, because that grief is just as valid, but can often feel confusing and hard to talk about. Jesse Jackson said we live on the dash between our birth date and our death date. None of us know how long that dash is. Every day we're talking to people who are somewhere on that line, and their age is no indication of how far along it they might be. And despite the millions of people that have come and gone before us, and despite death being a part of daily life, it's not something we're very good at talking about or acknowledging in the UK. We often hide it away, sweep it out of sight as if we're embarrassed by it and don't know what to do with it. And that's probably because grieving doesn't feel good. In many ways, we have no control over grief. We don't know when it's coming and we can't stop it. Grief often drags us kicking and screaming away from what we want the most, leaving us painfully aware there's not a single thing we can do about it. Grief can be so powerful it even affects us physically, and that, quite frankly, can be scary. Our grief is also unique to us. It has to be, because we are all unique, and no two people respond the same way, even to losing the same person. So we shouldn't compare losses, because it doesn't help anyone to know their loss could have been better, or it might have been worse. But this can also make grief lonely sometimes too. So because of this, I'm going to assume that grief is not our favourite thing to go through. But I believe we do grief a huge disservice if we leave it there. Just paint it black, mark it as bad, and wish it never happened. Because I know, and so do many others, that painful as it is, grief can also bring beauty and hope into our lives. If we let it. Now, this doesn't mean that one day grief just up and leaves you, and that everything is good again. In fact, it's far more likely that grief will walk beside you every day of your life, in some capacity. But what form that takes is down to us individually. I read this poem on social media a couple of years ago, and it really spoke to me about this exact thing. It's called Grief by Gwen Flowers. I had my own notion of grief. I thought it was the sad time that followed the death of someone you love, and you had to push through it to get to the other side. But I'm learning there is no other side. There is no pushing through, but rather there is absorption, adjustment, acceptance, and grief is not something you complete, but rather you endure. Grief is not a task to finish and move on, but an element of yourself, an alteration of your being, a new way of seeing, a new dimension of self. You don't get over grief. It will eventually become part of you, and you will sort of absorb it into a new version of you. And we do have some control over this, because your grief will become whatever you let it. It can create beauty in your life, but it can also destroy it. This is the choice. What will we allow it to become? I was speaking to an expert on grief recently, and she said there comes a point when people have to decide, am I going to stay with the dead or re-engage with the living? The podcast I host doesn't just look at grief and loss. It also looks at hope. Is it possible to find hope in every kind of loss? And I chat to people who have been through each type of grief firsthand to find out. And I've discovered that finding hope through grief is also a choice. Hope doesn't just come to some people and not to others. It's a choice to believe hope can exist and then find what that looks like for you. Desmond Tutu said, "Hope is being able to see that there is light, despite all of the darkness." It's a choice to open our eyes and see that there is always light, always hope, despite all of the darkness we might find around us. Hope is not pretending there isn't any darkness, or that the darkness has suddenly vanished. It's a light that shines through the dark into our grief. I love that we use candles at a service like this. They symbolise hope, love and faith, and remind us that there can still be light even in dark times. And for those who believe, it also reminds us of Jesus, the light of the world. In the book of John, it says this about Jesus coming at Christmas. What came into existence was life, and the life was light to live by. The life light blazed out of the darkness. The darkness couldn't put it out. Darkness cannot extinguish light on its own. Grief cannot extinguish hope on its own. In both situations, light and hope only live or die because we let them. Some of the most inspiring stories that you'll have heard, the charities you'll support, the films you'll watch or the books you'll read will have come from or contain some form of loss. Stories and experiences that only contain mountaintop moments and no valleys are not inspiring or even relatable. We are more inspired by people who go through pain, loss and grief and then allow hope and light in to create something wonderful because of it. It doesn't mean their grief was any easier to go through. It was what they chose to do with it. For us, this doesn't need to mean setting up a multi-million-pound charity or directing an Oscar-winning film. It might be a small, brave action, like sharing our grief to help someone else, or maybe just choosing to let hope in instead of despair, or maybe allowing ourselves to heal. I'd like to share with you what gives me hope in my grief. It's probably no surprise to you being in a church hall with a vicar leading the service and singing hymns that what gives the person delivering the talk hope is Jesus. But what you won't already know is why. Why does Jesus and believing in God help me in my grief? How does it help me? Well, it's not an airy-fairy, I believe there's a God, so that makes everything simple. Believing in God doesn't make my grief any easier to go through. There aren't less tears or less anger. It doesn't answer all the why questions I might have about why I've lost family members and friends, or why my health has not been great for so many years, or why our friend's only child died at the age of 8. I don't know why my husband and I couldn't have children. I mean, I know the physical reasons why, but I don't know why in the grand scheme of things this wasn't something that would happen for us. I don't know why some babies die without taking one breath and some of us live to be over 100. But then for me, faith is not about God answering all my questions and making life easier for me. Nice as that would be at times. We live in a broken world alongside illness, disease and death, none of which was God's original plan for us, by the way. And what helps me in this is knowing I have someone with me in it. I'm not alone. How do I know that? Because I've experienced what Jesus can do when you ask him into your life. I have a relationship with him that is not trivial. He's my friend, my saviour, my comforter, my light in the dark. He's life-giving, and that's made my life worth living, even in the times when I struggle. There's a myriad of grief in the Bible, in all forms, which is helpful to me when I go through rough patches. But it's also full of promises that I've chosen to believe and lean on that help me through the hard times. Like Psalm 34, which we just heard read a minute ago. The Lord is close to the brokenhearted. He rescues those whose spirits are crushed. Matthew 10, not a single sparrow can fall to the ground without your Father knowing it, and the very hairs on your head are all numbered. So don't be afraid. You are more valuable to God than a whole flock of sparrows. Psalm 56, you keep track of all my sorrows. You have collected all my tears in your bottle. You have recorded each one in your book. Psalm 147, he heals the brokenhearted and bandages their wounds. Hebrews 13, God has said, I will never fail you, I will never abandon you. So we can say with confidence, the Lord is my helper, so I will have no fear. In Isaiah 1, he promises to comfort all who mourn, to bestow on them a crown of beauty instead of ashes, an oil of joy instead of mourning, and a garment of praise instead of a spirit of despair. Revelation 7, he will lead them to springs of life-giving water, and God will wipe every tear from their eyes. These promises, and so much more in the Bible, give me hope beyond the grief of this world. It's been said that God doesn't parachute us out of our challenges, grief, sadness and frustrations. He parachutes in to be with us. God has promised to always be with us. Would we like him to fix every bad thing in our life and in the world? Sure. Is that a realistic solution for all the problems that humans cause? Not really. Like a loving parent, he doesn't fix everything for us and pull us out of every bad thing we encounter. That's not helpful to our growth, but he does promise to be there with us. But there's more than just him being there with me, with us. Jesus hasn't just promised to be with me in my pain, he's also been through it personally. Jesus said just before he was crucified by the very people he'd come to save, my soul is crushed with grief to the point of death. He knows what it's like to be lied to, betrayed, to watch friends die, to lose a parent, to be ignored, rejected, despised, misunderstood, and murdered. He knew the single life, the childless life. He knew hard work. He knew what it was to be poor, to be a refugee. He knew what it was to stand up for something you believe in, that you know will benefit others, and be rejected and ridiculed for it. Jesus knew hard times when he was a human on earth. But then, in classic Jesus style, he goes one better again. Jesus isn't just there with us. He doesn't just share these things we go through. He conquered them. By rising from the dead, he conquered grief, he conquered pain, he conquered tears, he conquered death. Not just because he could, but out of love. For me, for you. And because of this, we worship a living God, not a dead one. God knows your pain. He collects your tears. He sits with you when you're alone in your grief. And one day, he longs to wipe every tear from your eye and give you an everlasting life, where all the pain, sorrow, grief, and heartache of this world will be swept away. This may not always be easy or feel true, but in my experience, it's worth fighting for. It's not tricky or complicated to choose hope in Jesus. Psalm 42 shows us just how simple it can be to make that decision in a few words. Why am I discouraged? Why is my heart so sad? I will put my hope in God. I will praise him again, my Saviour and my God.